Today, we're going to explore some ways we can all be better citizens for our oceans through our decisions about seafood. As part of our Iberostar Wave of Change seafood strategy, we believe our clients can not only enjoy a responsible seafood offering, but take lessons home with them. If consumers don't ask questions about the sourcing of their seafood, most supply chains won't engage in seafood sustainability. Let's find out more about the role each one of us can play to protect our oceans. My name is Dr. Megan Morikawa, and I'm the Global Director of Sustainability at Iberostar Group. And it's my pleasure today to introduce a fantastic panel to have a conversation on how you can all help the oceans. First, I'd like to introduce Laura Rodríguez, who's the Marine Stewardship Council Program Director for Spain and Portugal. We also have Mel Bandler, who's Retail Sustainability Manager at Fairtrade. We also have Erin Taylor, Senior Project Director for the Business Engagement Team at Fishwise. And we have Adriana Sanchez, the Responsible Seafood Strategy Director at Iberostar's Wave of Change movement. So to start us off, I think we'd love to know a little bit more about what your organizations are doing. So Mel, if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit about how Fairtrade is helping consumers make better choices about their seafood purchases.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me to start off, but I'm really excited to talk a little bit about Fairtrade and seafood because it's actually our newest program. So the Fairtrade Seafood Program joined the Fairtrade family in 2015. And when that was launched, it joined all the products that are normally associated with Fairtrade. So if you think of the coffees or the teas or the cocos, and what that allows is for a consumer to actually recognize a label that's across the whole store. And so by having that recognition that by seeing a green label, and understanding that means it supports the humans throughout that value chain, it allowed that same conscious consumerism to really capture what it means for fishermen. And so our goal is to really empower fishermen livelihoods and to make it so that they have more resilient coastal communities and also empowered to think about the environmental well-being of their communities and their future sustainability and future planning. And so we're really excited to work with around 10 supply chains now, mostly wild caught, but we do have one aquaculture partner, and that allows consumers to go and shop their beliefs to empower fishermen around the world.
Thanks so much, Mel. I think looking for a label is a really great tool that consumers can use. Laura, can you tell us a little bit about the Marine Stewardship Council and how you guys help consumers make better choices?
Yeah, sure. We've been working for 20 years already in our certification and leveling program. Our program is focusing on wild capture, and the way we work is through three elements. From one side, we have the certification of fisheries. This is an independent and science-based process in which any fishery in the world, industrial, artisanal, can verify they meet the best practices in environmental fishing. We also have a traceability program called the Chain of Custody to assure that certified products are not mixed with non-certified products from the fishery to the consumer. And the third is the Blue Label. The Blue Label allows the consumer to identify and recognize which seafood comes from a certified seafood. And this way they can play an active role contributing to the health of the ocean and also to safeguard the future supplies for the marine resources for the future generation.
It's a really great example of all the way from the fishery to the plate. There's both that traceability, but also the ability to have the confidence of knowing the product that you are purchasing. Erin, we'd love to hear a little bit as well on how Fishwise is working to help consumers make better choices.
Great. Yeah. And I echo Mel's comment about thanks for having me. So Fishwise is located in the United States and we're a nonprofit. And I love that Mel brought up this word of empowerment already this early into the conversation, because for Fishwise, our roots are all about this particular goal of empowering people with knowledge in this case. In the early 2000s, the founders of Fishwise realized that when you go into a grocery store or restaurant, even if they wanted to buy something in a conscious way, they just didn't have enough information to do that. So they approached the grocery stores in our area and said, hey, we want to try something out. We want to help you put more information about your seafood and its sustainability out there in front of the consumer so that they can make better choices. And the grocery stores said, sure, we'll try it out. And so we helped them assign sustainability ratings to the seafood they were selling. And as it turns out, what they found was that indeed, when you label something as green or yellow or red, or you give more information, the consumers increasingly asked for the green options and moved away from some of those red options. And so providing this level of information and being transparent proved to be a win-win for both the environment and the businesses that we were working with. So over time now, Fishwise does all different kinds of work, and our work has really grown, and the types of companies and organizations we work with has really grown. But that same core tenet of empowering people with information to take action is still at the center of what we do. Now we don't do this quite as directly with consumers as my colleagues on the phone do with labels, but we do still help companies analyze their sourcing, improve human and labor rights practices, with the same thread of educating them so that they can educate their consumers, giving them support so they can be transparent.
Thanks so much, guys. I think you gave really great examples of tools and visual cues that consumers can use to be able to make better choices. But I think this win-win is really interesting, and I'm curious to explore this further, because when consumers choose these sustainable products, I would imagine that it has impacts on the actual fisheries or aquaculture practices themselves. Mel, maybe you could tell us from Fairtrade if there are any anecdotes or examples on how consumer engagement actually made a change in the seafood supply chain for the betterment of the oceans.
Absolutely. So one really exciting thing about the Fairtrade model is that for every purchase, there's an additional amount that goes into an investment fund for the fishermen that are actually harvesting or fishing that product. So I think that there is a very exciting piece surrounding protecting the oceans is that we also, certify that coffee or those other on-land agricultural products. And when that investment fund is created, they can spend it however they want. Specifically to our seafood program, 30% of that has to actually go to protecting the oceans. So we're really excited that because of that, the fishermen are not only able to empower themselves, but they can really think about how can they, guarantee ocean health or think about what's best for their community's well-being. And so we've seen some very cool projects around mangrove planting and different things to really think about coastal ecosystems and different projects that really focus on cleanup. And so whether that be, taking a day to go get plastic that's in their way or stuff like that, there's really been a focus around how they can better be ocean stewards and think about not only their well-being, but the ocean's health and the longevity and long-term planning for their community, but also their ocean community and, what their livelihood is based on.
I think one of the other things that I've personally experienced in a market is that sometimes it's hard to navigate all of these sorts of choices, all of the labels and ingredients and products. And I'm wondering, maybe Laura can tell us, what are some misconceptions that consumers have when it comes to purchasing sustainable seafood?
Well, I can rely or tell you about my experience in Spain and Portugal because it's where I work. There is still a misconception in some consumers that the oceans are depleted already. So they think that the best way to contribute to the ocean health is not to eat seafood at all. And I think this misconception is really a lack of information, because it is true that today, according to FAO, 33% of the stock populations are overfished, and this means that it's in a bad status. But there are also many other populations and fisheries that are doing a great job, and consumers can be confident that when they buy sustainable seafood, in our case identified by the blue label, they can really do a responsible choice, and they are continue with their healthy diet and also supporting communities that depend on the seafood. So this is one of the misconceptions that really need a lot of communication and information, and all the tools of our organizations contribute really to give high visibility to the good practices and all these fisheries and businesses that are committed to sustainability right now.
I think that's a great example of how maybe we should just kind of not be so scared to not purchase seafood, but find ways to be able to purchase that seafood in a way that is sustainable. Erin, this question is for you because I know that there's really great labels that are out there, but those labels aren't always available as visual cues to tell consumers that a product is or isn't from a sustainable origin, or does or doesn't support the people who've produced that product. Can you give us some tips or other tools that consumers can use if there are no labels?
Yeah, definitely. The fun news is that if there are no immediately obvious sustainability labels like that, you get to be a bit of an investigator. And for the most detailed information, if you like to nerd out on this kind of stuff like me, you could dive into a seafood guide. There are a few consumer guides out there really tailored for folks going and shopping at the grocery store or in a restaurant. If you're based in the US, you can check out the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program, where they provide public recommendations on seafood options that fall under a best choice or a green, a good alternative, which is yellow, or something to avoid, which is red. And these recommendations are based on robust scientific criteria. For a more global perspective, another set of really useful sustainable seafood guides comes from the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF. They have sustainable seafood guides that are available for 25 different countries, or somewhere around 25 countries, and in those languages as well, which is great. And they also use a green, yellow, red system. So those two are some of the most comprehensive and recently updated consumer guides that you can use. It is important to note that those are focused on environmental criteria. So if you really want to dig in a little bit more and know about the social criteria as well, or know about the traceability of your seafood, then that's where you want to think about those certifications. And if you don't see the MSC or the Fairtrade label for my colleagues that we're talking with today, there's actually a lot of labels out there, and it can be pretty confusing. There's somewhere over 100 seafood sustainability labels. So there's a couple tools you can use to decipher which ones are pretty good, but some common ones that everybody in our community really looks to beyond MSC and Fairtrade include the best aquaculture practices, or BAP. Global GAP is another one. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council is the farmed seafood equivalent to the Marine Stewardship Council. So there's lots of different labels to look at. But the final thing I'll say is if you just don't have enough information available about what you're eating to look up in a consumer guide, or you're not as excited to nerd out about that stuff as I am, or you have 15 minutes in the grocery store with your kid and they're screaming and running that direction and you don't have time to look this stuff up, there's just a couple helpful rules of thumb that you can go by too to help you make better choices. So what I would say there is, first, consider the size of what you're eating. So really big fish like tuna and grouper and swordfish often take a long time to grow, and they reproduce less quickly. So they're a little bit more vulnerable to overfishing. So you can look for things like anchovies and squid and mackerel that are smaller and faster growing. Following on this concept, one of the most foolproof bits of seafood you could eat is farm shellfish, so oysters and clams and mussels, which are low on the food chain and pretty often a pretty sustainable choice. The second thing I would say is to look for frozen seafood. Despite any stigmas you might have, frozen seafood can be incredibly high quality and really sustainable. And that's because food waste is a really big problem across food commodities, and for seafood it can be up rates of over 50% when you take things home. So rather than buying fresh seafood that you might end up wasting because you procrastinated on cooking it and it's been a couple days and you're not sure if it's still good, maybe take home some frozen fillets, which might have been flash frozen right away after they were caught and maybe are even higher quality than what's at the fresh counter. And then finally, I would just say diversify. There's over 12,000 species available commercially, and around the world, we tend to eat just the same top 10 or top 5 species for the majority of what we consume. So next time you want to try some seafood, just try something you haven't had before. And that's a good way to go to diversify what we're eating.
Those are some really great tips and advice, Erin. I know at Iberostar, we think a lot about the footprint of any of the products that it is that we're using. And I know there's often kind of a misconception that animal proteins are something that have a really high carbon footprint. And while that is true, seafood's one of the best animal proteins that we can consume from a carbon footprint standpoint. It's a really great piece by the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, saying that if we find out ways to do aquaculture better and more sustainably, this could really help us to feed the next billion while also working on climate change issues. So I think this is also another really great way for us to think about how we can include a little more seafood in our life. Adriana, do you have other tips for clients?
Just like really briefly, I think that if you check the website for your favorite supermarket, you can also learn about what kind of commitments they have. And sometimes they even have their own signage of sharing what is sustainable, what is responsible. So that's another helpful tool. If you don't want to, nerd out and do a lot of research, you can just look at what your current supermarkets do in terms of commitment, and then just, invest on supporting that commitment by buying the seafood from their store.
These are all great tips. And this is a way that we can make sure that our choices matter and make a difference in the markets. But I think we're also curious on what are some questions that consumers can ask, not only to their local markets, but also generally to NGOs, to businesses and organizations on how they can raise demand for sustainable seafood. Laura, maybe you'd be able to give us a couple examples on some questions that are really useful for consumers to have to find a way for them to also support a commitment to responsible seafood.
Yeah, consumers play a crucial role to make a sustainable movement advance and accelerate. If consumers raise interest and demand MSC Blue Label or other credible certifications or that are today here, they really show that the sustainability matters, and the investment that the fisheries and the businesses are doing to integrate the sustainable seafood is really providing a market advantage. Otherwise, it's very difficult to maintain this commitment in the long term if the consumer is not interested or it is only looking for the price or their favorite seafoods. There are companies that are making very bold commitments, as for example, Iberostar in the tourism sector, and with very clear targets and very transparent reporting, and other companies are much more behind on this. So it's important that consumers also support those pioneers and those companies that are going ahead in the market. And the last thing I would like to share with you is that we have just done a market research. This research we do every 2 years is a global research about how consumers see sustainable seafood, and there are very positive trends. So in the 2020 research globally, we see that 58% of consumers have already taken any action towards sustainable consumption of seafood. This means changing up the brand, changing the species, change the place where they buy seafood, or even reducing the amount of seafood they eat, just because they want to be more responsible in the consumption of fish. And also we see that younger people and parents are the ones that are more willing to take more action in the future. So this is very promising, and we expect that really all the willing from the people and the care about the oceans is really transformed into action when they go to a restaurant or to a shop.
Laura, I think that's a really great set of examples on what individual citizens can do. And as we wrap up our conversation series at the end of a week that started with World Oceans Day, I think it's important for all of us to realize that even though the ocean seems at times far away, the choices that we make in our food and in our grocery stores really can make a difference, and that there are a lot of tools out there for us to be able to make commitments as individuals to a responsible consumption of seafood, along with with the great organizations that we have here and Iberostar through our commitment through Wave of Change. I want to say thank you guys so much for being a part of this conversation and for your great tips and dialogue. And we look forward to continuing the conversation from here. Thank you.